Welcome to this series on the gateway process, where I'll be reading straight from a declassified government document, which goes on to explain in terms of physics how a combination of meditation, hypnosis, and biofeedback can result in higher states of intuitive knowledge. Follow along as Brian and I provide commentary on these sections as we go. Hemi-sync recordings are available on YouTube and Spotify, and I'll leave a link for everything below. 1. Introduction. In order to describe the Monroe Institute technique for achieving altered states of consciousness, the gateway experience, involving brain hemisphere synchronization, or Hemi-sync, the most effective way to begin is to briefly profile the basic mechanics which underlay operation of related methods such as hypnosis, transcendental meditation, and biofeedback. It is easiest to effectively describe what gateway is by beginning with a short description of those associated techniques that share some common aspects with the gateway experience, but which are nevertheless different. In this way, we can develop a frame of reference at the outset which will provide useful concepts to explain and understand gateway by comparison as we proceed. 2. Hypnosis. According to the theories of psychologist Ronald Stone and the biomedical engineering models of Itzhak Bentov, hypnosis is basically a technique which permits acquisition of direct access to the sensory motor cortex and pleasure centers and lower cerebral emotional portions and associated pleasure centers of the right side of the human brain, following successful disengagement of the stimulus screening function of the left hemisphere of the brain. The left hemisphere of the brain is the self-cognitive, verbal, linear, reasoning component of the mind. It fulfills the function of screening incoming stimuli by categorizing, assessing, and assigning meaning prior to allowing passage to the right hemisphere of the mind. The right hemisphere, which functions as the non-critical, holistic, non-verbal, and pattern-oriented component of the brain, appears to accept what the left hemisphere passes to it without question. Consequently, if the left hemisphere can be distracted either through boredom or through reduction in the soporific semi-sleep state, external stimuli to include hypnotic suggestions are allowed to pass unchallenged into the right hemisphere, where they are accepted and acted upon directly. The result may involve an emotional reaction originating in the lower cerebral region, sensory motor responses requiring involvement with the cortex, and so on. Both the sensory and the motor cortices of the right cerebral portion of the brain contain a sequence of points known as the homunculus, which corresponds to points in the body. See Exhibit 1, next page. Stimulation of the corresponding area on the cortex causes intermediate response in the associated portion of the body. Consequently, induction of the suggestion that the left leg is numb, if it reaches the right hemisphere unchallenged and is referred to the appropriate area of the sensory cortex, will result in an electrical reaction being generated that will induce the feeling of numbness. Similarly, the suggestion that the person is experiencing a general feeling of happiness and well-being would be referred to the appropriate pleasure centers located in the lower cerebral portion or in the cortex of the right hemisphere, thereby inducing the suggested feeling of euphoria. Finally, suggestions such as one that inform the hypnotic subject that he enjoys enhanced concentration or powers of memory would be responded to in the right hemisphere by accessing unused information storage capacity normally held in reserve as a result of left hemisphere selection and control processes. This aspect will become significant in the context of the gateway process when attention is given to examining the way that hypnosis may be used to accelerate progress in the early stages of the gateway experience. 3. Transcendental meditation. On the other hand, transcendental meditation works in a distinctly different fashion. In this technique, intense and protracted single-minded concentration on the process of drawing energy up the spinal cord ultimately results in what appears to be creation of acoustical standing waves in the cerebral ventricles, which are then conducted to the gray matter in the cerebral cortex on the right side of the brain. As a result, according to Bentov, these waves will stimulate and eventually polarize the cortex in such a way that it will tend to conduct a signal along the homunculus, starting from the toes on up. The Bentov biomedical model, as described in the book by Lee Sanella, MD, entitled Kundalini Psychosis or Transcendence, states that the standing acoustical waves are the result of the altered rhythm of heart sounds which are occasioned by prolonged practice of meditation, and which set up sympathetic vibrations in the walls of the fluid-filled cavities which comprise the third and lateral ventricles of the brain. In addition, according to Bentov, the states of bliss described by those whose Kundalini symptoms have completed the full loop along the hemispheres may be explained by a self-stimulation of the pleasure centers in the brain caused by the circulation of a current along the sensory cortex. Bentov also notes that most of the described symptoms start on the left side of the body, means that it is mostly a development occurring on the right hemisphere. Although normally a period of meditation involving intense concentration and practice for 5 years or some is required to, quote, bring up the Kundalini. Bentov states that exposure to mechanical or acoustical vibrations in the range of 4 to 7 Hz cycles per second for protracted periods may achieve the same effect. Bentov cites as an example repeated riding in a car whose suspension or seat combination produced that range of vibrations, or being exposed for long periods of time to these frequencies caused, for instance, by an air conditioner duct. He also notes that cumulative effect of these vibrations may be able to trigger a spontaneous physio-kundalini sequence in susceptible people who have a particularly sensitive nervous system.
I think it's magic, no, it's music. Crescent moons and soothsayers, and the dimension started to peel apart in layers. Watch out.
That's pretty crazy. The idea that the simple vibrations that are around you can put you into a spontaneous state.
Yeah, but it's also talking about how it's polarizing your brain.
Mm-hmm.
So you're talking about just these vibrations. You could produce
Well, think about this. Think about polarization from a magnetic sense.
Yeah.
You've got the positive and you got the negative.
Mm-hmm.
Now they talk about this later in the paper, but basically what he's talking about is you're able to turn your essentially like a bar of energy in your body from the top from the top on up. And when they talk about it in the paper, it doesn't necessarily stop at the top of your head. That essentially you're able to create like this like independent energy force that essentially like is almost infinite. And we'll discuss it a little bit more in detail as we get a little bit later on. I think section 6 is the lamp versus laser, and that's where they talk about this. But there's some really wild stuff going on, and they're just casually referencing it in here about what's actually possible or what's fundamentally happening when you're doing something as simple as transcendental meditation, hypnosis, or biofeedback, which we'll get into in a minute.
I think it's magic, no, it's music. Crescent moons and soothsayers, and the dimension started to peel apart in layers. Watch out.
4. Biofeedback. The third consciousness altering methodology, which will be briefly described as biofeedback. Biofeedback is somewhat unique in that it actually employs the self-cognitive powers of the left hemisphere to gain access to such areas of the right brain as the lower cerebral, motor, and sensory cortices, and assorted pain or pleasure centers. Instead of suppressing the left hemisphere as is done in hypnosis, or largely bypassing and ignoring it as is done in transcendental meditation, biofeedback teaches the left hemisphere first to visualize the desired result, and then to recognize the feelings associated with the experience of successful right hemisphere access to the specific lower cerebral cortex, pain or pleasure, or other areas in the manner needed to produce the desired result. Special self-monitoring devices such as the digital thermometer are used to inform the left brain when it succeeds in keying the right hemisphere into accessing the appropriate area. Once this is done, the left brain can then repeatedly instruct the right brain to reestablish the pathways involved so as to produce the same external, objective measures of success. In this way, the pathways are strengthened and emphasized to such an extent that left brain consciousness is enabled to access appropriate areas in the right brain using a conscious demand mode. For example, if the subject wishes to increase the circulation in the left leg in order to speed up healing, he may concentrate with his left brain on achieving that result, while carefully monitoring a digital thermometer connected to the left leg. When the concentrated effort begins to achieve success, the digital thermometer will register an increase in the temperature of the left leg. At that point, the subject can mentally, left brain, associate the sensations experienced with the result achieved, and can begin to emphasize by memory recall the same process to cause its strengthening by affirmation and repetition. In this way, pain can be blocked, healing can be enhanced, malignant tumors can apparently be suppressed and ultimately destroyed. The body's pleasure centers can be stimulated, and a variety of specific physiological results can be achieved. In addition, biofeedback may be used to greatly accelerate achievement of deep meditative states, particularly for beginners who have no experience in meditative techniques and whose progress in that methodology is enhanced through effective visualization and external objective affirmation. Display of the subject's brainwave patterns on a cathode ray tube has proven to be a laboratory-validated means by which subjects can quickly learn to place themselves in profoundly relaxed states characterized by the sort of quietude and singularity of mental focus associated with advanced meditation.
I think it's magic, no, it's music. Crescent moons and soothsayers, and the dimension started to peel apart in layers. Watch out.
Yeah, one of the things I thought was really interesting here about how they talked about creating pathways, and that essentially when you create the pathway, what you're doing is you're obviously making like the point A, point B connection, but then every time you go back, you strengthen that pathway. And so it's like this idea that like once you've been somewhere, you know how to do it. You just need to do it. You know what I mean? You just need to strengthen that pathway and go through that process again, you know, and it's like so weird to think that simple concepts like affirmation, you know, and like being committed to an outcome could actually have an effect.
Right.
Because we don't think in a world like that. We think where everything's like physical effort equals an outcome, not like good thoughts about yourself. Like,
Right. So yeah, it was using the example of like healing your left leg, and it's like how do you know when you get back to that point? And it's just the use of some simple instruments being able to tell you like, oh, you got some more blood flow, this part of your body's warming up.
well, and this is kind of like the basis of EMDR from what I understand. I've never done it, so I can't speak, you know, about it with any great authority, but you know, just the basic concept that you're taking the mind and you're allowing it to create new pathways when it comes to reflecting on previously traumatic experiences and kind of allowing yourself to understand where to put things now instead of it having just be like a big scary monster that you don't really know how to deal with, but it's always there. You know, and so that's kind of interesting. I guess they use like lights and eye movement and stuff like that to recondition the brain, but it seems like this is in the 1980s doing what we now refer to as EMDR to some degree or another. But this is more just the monitoring. The basically their position is they're just interested in getting you to a relaxed enough state, and they're using the biofeedback and the electroencephalogram in order to make sure that your brain waves are at a level that's consistent with your ability to accomplish what they want to accomplish. What we do now is more of a therapy-oriented system. Since you can do that and bring your brain into this receptive state, let's do that and let's address your trauma and allow you to be receptive to the trauma being addressed. So.
And then we got one last section.
It's magic, no, it's music. Crescent moons and soothsayers, and the dimension started to peel apart in layers. Watch out.
5. Gateway and Hemi-sync. Now that we have briefly profiled the basic mechanics of the principal techniques for altering and expanding consciousness, which share some of the objectives and or methods employed by the gateway experience, we may proceed to focus on what that technique actually involves. Fundamentally, the gateway experience is a training system designed to bring enhanced strength, focus, and coherence to the amplitude and frequency of brainwave output between the left and right hemispheres so as to alter consciousness, moving it outside the physical sphere so as to ultimately escape even the restrictions of time and space. The participant then gains access to the various levels of intuitive knowledge which the universe offers. What differentiates the gateway experience from forms of meditation is its use of the Hemi-sync technique, which is defined in a monograph by Monroe Institute trainer Melissa Yeager as a state of consciousness defined when the EEG patterns of both hemispheres are simultaneously equal in amplitude and frequency. Although Hemi-sync seems to be rather rare and of only short duration in ordinary human consciousness, Melissa Yeager states that audio tapes developed by Bob Monroe can induce and sustain Hemi-sync with the Institute's basic Focus 3 tapes. She also notes that studies conducted by Elmer and Alice Green at the Menninger Foundation have shown that subjects with 20 years of training in Zen meditation could consistently establish Hemi-sync at will, sustaining it for over 15 minutes. Dr. Stuart Twemlow, a psychiatrist and a research associate of the Monroe Institute, reports that In our studies of the effect of the Monroe tape system on brainwaves, we have found that the tapes encourage the focusing of brain energy. It can be measured as with a light bulb in watts, into a narrower and narrower frequency band. This focusing of energy is not unlike the yoga concept of one-pointedness, which we may translate in Western terms as single-mindedness. Dr. Twemlow goes on to observe that as the individual goes into tapes beyond focus 3, there is a gradual increase in brainwave size, which is a measure of brain energy and power.
I think it's magic, no, it's music. Crescent moons and soothsayers, and the dimension started to peel apart in layers. Watch out.
Well, that's interesting. So apparently your brain is a muscle that you can work out for outcomes that you might not even be aware of.
Yeah, all you need to do is go bother with trying to focus it.
Well, 20 years of meditation, but yeah.
Yeah.
There's a book I can read. Yeah, that's pretty wild. I think it's important to talk about like kind of the nature of this project right now. This isn't like some kind of humanitarian effort where they're trying to figure out how to get people to live their lives better. This is like 1983, depths of the Cold War, Reagan's president. We're getting into, some cool Star Wars stuff. And this is just another area of the battlefield. And so they're considering, how can we make this like an effective weapon, or how can we use this, to overcome our adversary. But I think the big takeaway is like, man, simple applications in your own life, there's a lot of possibility here. I mean, they talk about not being able to sustain it for a very long period of time, but imagine if you could have just 5 minutes while you were in a meditative state where like you were having visions and you were doing and seeing things that you'd simply never seen. It wouldn't be too little time. It would just be, how do I get back there again?
The participant then gains access to the various levels of intuitive knowledge which the universe offers.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting that they said you only had to get to focus level 3 in order to actually be able to engage in some of the Hemi-sync stuff.
Right. And what's the highest level that you've heard, like 12 or 13, something like that?
It goes up pretty high. I'd have to glance at the actual paper itself because they talk about the levels at the very end.
And like, yeah, in those points, you're doing like dematerialization.
I know there's like section, or level 15 was one that they're talking about. It looks like focus stage 12 is where you're dealing with like altered consciousnesses at the highest level. You're seeing the most of the holographic patterns, and you seem to be like most connected to the world as it really exists, not necessarily how your consciousness perceives it. And so in that moment, you understand 4 dimensions, and it's not like the 4th dimension is anything spectacular. It just removes our concept of time and space as we understand it.
Yes.
Yeah.
This kind of reminds me of have you seen that movie Lucy with Scarlett Johansson?
Mm-hmm.
She takes like this pill that's like eventually supposed to like in a way make her like God and one with the universe. She like at the very end like dematerializes, and she just is becoming more and more like, it's like unlocking 100% of your brain is what this pill does, kind of like the Bradley Cooper movie. But she's able to like transform her body. Like she is showing some scientists, she's having a conversation with them, and her hand is changing into a claw, into like a fish's fin, and then into 2 hands coming out of one arm, and then back into normal. And she's like able to manipulate all parts of matter.
It's simply what you perceive, or what you manifest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is starting to make me think about.
But I go back to my point. I mean, we were talking about doing some casual reading of the introduction to the Bhagavad Gita, and they talk a lot about like, the sense of self, you know what I mean? And like, you need to like, I guess from my perspective, we're in the here and now for a reason, and it's like, there needs to be like a level of respect for that, that like, I mean, they talked about how caring for our body is like caring for our instrument, you know what I mean? That it's like, this is a tool that we've been provided that we're supposed to care for, and so that especially ties you to the here and now, because that's the only place your body really is in the here and now. And so then you think about the concepts of being centered and grounded and everything like that, and it's this conscious awareness of our creation, but simply understanding that I am here and I am now, but understanding that here and now is not like somewhere in California at approximately 12 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. Here and now is somewhere entirely different.
Yeah, I like that analogy of like our bodies being like an instrument, especially musical, especially with the frequencies and being in tune with
Well, and knowing that your body makes noises all on its own, and I'm not just talking about the farts.
Yeah.
You know, it's like just the rapid movement of all the molecules that make you. I mean, that makes a sound with all that friction.
The resonance.
Yeah, the resonance. Yeah, absolutely.
I've always considered like meditation and stuff to be a little bit woo woo, especially hypnosis. Like, I don't know. I didn't bother. I didn't think it was legit enough to even bother looking into. But I mean, this is just what the government has to say.
Yeah, and I think for me, like, I just really got jaded towards a lot of religions. You know what I mean? It's like the institution, the idea of an institutional body, like governing your belief system, just seems like so antithetical to knowing who God is. I mean, however you get there, that's cool, but that's just my story, you know. And so, kind of running. I mean, as we go through this paper, it'll provide a bit more of an illumination about, you know, kind of this universe that we live in, at least how they perceive it. And in fact, the big thing that they talk about in this paper is like, how do we make sense of it all? We're seeing all these outcomes, but in what universe is this possible? You know, and so then they have to go back and reconsider some of the more fundamental notions of like, what is time and space? Where are we right now? You know, and I think that's where you get into the real wild stuff.
Yeah, well, I love how official this is, just being a government document, and it, like what it was saying about how just tapping into universal consciousness. I mean, that in itself just tells me how like religion, I don't need anyone else to make contact with God.
Well, I think for me, how spoon-fed I've been my whole life when it comes to the notions of religion and spirituality. You know what I mean? That religion's always been the path to freedom, and spirituality is more like where the occult lies. And that's just simply not the truth. It's just spirituality is acknowledging that like I am created and that there's something greater than me. And in that simple acknowledgement, there's worship too. You know?
Yeah. Well, like let's see, the past like couple months, you kind of have made like a big change in direction you were going. As far, was it the start of reading this Project Gateway?
Probably like end of 2020, just kind of realized, you know, I'm a white male in my late 30s, kind of getting to that point where you might, you know, I don't know. But I kind of started realizing that I needed to just maybe get some new direction. I've kind of tapped out my resources. I've kind of like learned everything that I wanted to learn. I've always loved history. I've always loved politics. But man, you know, 20 years of being interested in that, and you just feel real empty. You know, it's like there's no real depth to any of it. So I started being more open to the idea of reading about stuff, listening to weird stories, and just embracing high strangeness. And somebody posted something on Twitter about remote viewing, and I'd heard about it before. I knew it was real, but I didn't know about the whole project. And so I went and downloaded the paper, and I read through the whole thing, and it was like, oh my gosh, like
and immediately proceeded to attempt to walk through a wall.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I noticed is the copy that they gave us in the first FOIA dump is missing a page. The 25th page of the document is gone. Vice actually went back and did another FOIA request. They got the 25th page, and there's some interesting stuff on there. I mean, the whole document's loaded full of interesting information, but you know, just make sure when you're reading it that you have the copy that's got the actual full copy, the 25th page, because that's omitted from the original one. And they talk a lot about like the concept of how the universe actually like works in that section, you know.
Yeah.
Now, what I like too about the paper, and we'll get into this, you know, more and more, but the big thing that they really set out to do is explain that this fundamental concept of the universe, wherein they believe all these weird things are possible, they really emphasize that like this doesn't do damage to like modern religion. That, you know, these concepts, these all like fully embrace the notions that exist within other modern religions, and they're not like violent towards them. They don't diminish them. In fact, really, it's almost like this perfect marriage of like religion and science, or, you know, religion, or excuse me, science and mysticism, whatever you want to call it. But it's just like this connection that just for me made sense.
Yeah, so that's the first 5 sections of the Project Gateway analysis paper.
We'll have a bit more commentary after each section. These first 5 were kind of self-explanatory, so there's not much going on in there. Maybe we'll double back around. There's a guy they talk about named Ronald Stone in the beginning of the hypnosis one. He's actually, as best I can tell, he's a practicing LMFT right now in California. And you go to his website, he talks about his involvement in his hypnosis programs throughout the late 70s. And then he started a series of like programs in the early 80s, I think like 81 or 82. And I think I believe that's what they're referencing in the paper when they talk about Bentov and also that Ronald Stone guy and their findings about hypnosis, essentially like kind of shutting down the left brain's filter, you know, getting that secret synchronicity that's necessary for your brain to be at a harmonious state where it can receive information and truly think, kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. Synchronicity of frequency and amplitude is what it was saying.
Yeah. Pretty wild.
Yeah. So that's what we got for this block. of the paper. And if, like I said, if anyone wants to check it out themselves, I have a link in my bio, and look forward to talking to you guys again.
All right, have a good one.